You know, when we hear the name Jamestown, we usually picture settlers and buckle hats and the story of Pocahontas. But the real story is so much grittier. So let's forget the tale of exploration for a minute and think of it like this: a high-stakes 17th century startup. This was a corporate venture, backed by investors in London who were expecting a serious return on their investment. This is the story of that brutal business.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to see how this whole thing got started, this risky royal venture. We'll look at the 3 ships they sent out on this one big mission. Then we'll cover the absolutely perilous voyage over. After that, what happened when they landed in what seemed like paradise, but wasn't. And finally, we'll see how they survived those brutal first years.
All right, so before a single ship ever hit the water, this whole venture started in the halls of power back in London. It all began with a pitch, a really risky proposal to convince King James I and a bunch of private investors to bet their fortunes on a completely unknown land far, far away.
Now, if you looked at the paperwork, the official mission sounded pretty noble. The king's charter pitched the whole thing as this grand quest to spread Christianity and bring, quote, humane civilizations to the native peoples. You know, it was a fantastic 17th century PR spin.
Because hiding right behind that noble mission was the cold, hard reality of business. The Virginia Company of London was what's called a joint stock company. Think of it as the 17th century version of a modern corporation selling stock. And the investors, they were called adventurers, but they weren't funding a charity. No, they were gambling on a high-risk venture, and you better believe they expected to make a profit.
So what was the actual business plan? Well, the priorities were crystal clear. Number 1, find gold. If that didn't work out, they'd pivot to finding a shortcut to Asia, that legendary Northwest Passage, to get in on the super lucrative spice trade. And, as a backup, they'd set up a base to raid Spanish treasure ships and ship back resources like timber. God and glory? That was the pitch. Gold and geopolitics, those were the real goals.
Okay, so the funding was secured, the company gets its assets together, 3 ships, and a hand-picked group of colonists. But here's the thing, there was a critical and what would soon become a fatal mismatch between the skills this team had and the challenges they were about to walk into.
So here's the fleet. You've got the Susan Constant, the 120-ton flagship. That's basically the floating corporate headquarters. Then you've got the smaller Godspeed, a 40-ton support ship. And finally, the tiny little Discovery, a 20-ton scout ship. I mean, at barely 38 feet long, it was basically designed to poke around in the shallow rivers they were hoping to find.
And packed onto these 3 ships were 105 colonists. That's it. All of them men and boys sailing into a world they knew absolutely nothing about.
But right here, this is the critical flaw in the whole business plan. Just look at the makeup of the group. About half of them were gentlemen. These were men from wealthy backgrounds who, by the rules of their society, did not do manual labor. The other half? Well, they were the laborers and craftsmen who were expected to do all the actual work. Do you see the problem here?
The problem started way before they even saw Virginia. The voyage itself, which kicked off in December 1606, was a total ordeal. It was a huge warning sign of the incredible hardship that was going to define this entire enterprise.
144 days, that's almost 5 months, stuck on those tiny, cramped ships just across the Atlantic. A journey that really should have taken about 2 months tops.
So what went so horribly wrong? Well, it was just a perfect storm of bad luck and bad blood. First, they got trapped by storms in the English Channel for 6 weeks before they even really got going. Then, they had to take this long southern route just to catch the right winds, which added thousands of miles to the trip. And all that time, crammed together, led to some serious fighting. I mean, it got so bad that one of the colony's future leaders, Captain John Smith, was actually accused of mutiny and thrown in chains.
So when they finally got to Virginia in May of 1607, the place looked like a paradise. But the strategic choices they made, the ones based on their business plan from London, immediately crashed into the harsh realities of this new, well, let's call it a market.
This slide just illustrates that disconnect perfectly. They picked their spot based on the business plan, right? It had to be far upriver, so it was defensible from Spanish ships, and it needed deep water for their own ships. On paper, it was genius. But the reality? They picked a swampy, mosquito-infested island with terrible drinking water, and it was located right in the middle of the territory of the powerful Paspahegh tribe. So yeah, great for defense, absolutely awful for survival.
So, first order of business, set up a management team.
They opened these sealed orders from the board of directors back in London, which named a 13-man council to run the show. And, not surprisingly, this immediately led to infighting and power struggles. In the end, Edward Maria Wingfield, one of the wealthy gentlemen, was elected the first president, kind of like the first CEO.
Okay, let's get to the final act, the struggle to just survive. If we're talking business terms, the colony's burn rate, how fast it used up its resources, was catastrophic. And their most valuable resource, the one they were burning through the fastest, was people.
And the decline was just terrifyingly fast. They show up in May and build a fort, but June, they're already under attack. By September, food is running out, the council turns on itself, and they kick President Wingfield out. And by January, just 8 months after they landed, just look at that number. Only 38 of them were left.
From the 105 men and boys who started this whole thing with such high hopes, only 38 were still alive. Think about that. In just 8 months, disease, starvation, and conflict had wiped out nearly 2/3 of them. This entire venture was just weeks, maybe days away from complete and total failure.
But somehow, they held on. The tough, pragmatic John Smith was eventually elected president, and he famously laid down the law: "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." Crucial supply ships started showing up, and with them came new people, artisans to get industries like glassmaking started, and, critically, the first 2 women. And with the colony's very first wedding, it finally started to seem like a real community was starting to grow from the ashes.
But even after those little glimmers of hope, the absolute worst was still to come. The winter of 1609 became known as the starving time. The population was just decimated all over again, and the survivors, they were pushed to the absolute limit. Horrifying reports even made their way back to London that they had resorted to cannibalism just to stay alive.
Look, by any business metric of the time, the Jamestown venture was a disaster. It was a near-total failure, built on a flawed business model, a totally unprepared team, and a complete misunderstanding of the environment. And yet, it survived. It became the first permanent English colony in America. So the question we're left with is, how did this brutal, profit-driven, and truly desperate beginning go on to shape the complex and often contradictory nation that would one day grow from these swampy shores?